Hello there, and welcome. My name is Alexander, and you're listening to Another Realization. Many people have preconceived notions about what the world would look like when there was no government. In this video, I want to address the concerns people might have, and I want to go over some of the most prominent areas of concern. So, if they are actually rational and prone to happen, or if they are merely accepted out of superstition. Some assume that, if not for governments, crooks would be free to do as they please without any repercussions. However, this shows a profound misunderstanding of human nature and of what government actually is. People who use aggression against others, such as assault, theft, and murder, obviously are not restrained by their own morality or respect for the self-ownership of their victims. However, they may choose not to commit a particular crime if they imagine a risk of harm to themselves. That is called a deterrent. And deterrents, by definition, do not depend upon appealing to the conscience of the attacker, but instead make use of the attacker's instinct for self-preservation. To put it bluntly, the message which works on true criminals is not, "Do not do that because it's wrong." The message is, "Don't do that or you will get hurt." The supposed moral righteousness or authority of the threat against a would-be aggressor is completely irrelevant to the effectiveness of the deterrent. Whether it is a police officer, a dog, an angry homeowner, or even another thief, the only question in the attacker's mind is whether he is likely to suffer pain or death if he attempts to rob or attack someone. The point is, it is irrelevant to a true thief whether there is an authority posing the threat or a regular person. A thief couldn't care less about their authority. The idea that there needs to be an overarching government to be in place to be able to repel criminals is simply not true. Because authority simply has no effect on actual criminals, those individuals, for example, whose own consciences do not stop them from robbing or assaulting their neighbors because they do not care about the usual standards of right and wrong, also do not care what authority tells them to do. It is only those who are trying to be good who ever feel compelled to obey authority. The belief in authority is an erroneous belief about morality. It is the idea that obedience is morally good. To those who do not care about what is deemed good, the very people whose consciences are not enough to make them behave in a civilized manner, the myth of authority literally has no effect. Simply put, only those who do not need to be controlled, i.e. those already trying to live moral lives, feel any obligation to obey the controllers. Meanwhile, those who pose a real threat to peaceful society feel no moral obligation to obey any authority anyway. Generally speaking, all commands from authority, including inherently justifiable commands, such as do not steal and do not murder, are always either unnecessary and superfluous, when directed at good people, or ineffectual, when directed at bad people. It is difficult to imagine any situation in which an individual would otherwise have no qualms about committing theft, assault, or murder, but would however feel guilty about disobeying authority and violating laws which prohibit such actions. A distinction should be made here between moral obligation and fear of retaliation. A thief who feels no moral obligation to refrain from stealing will also feel no moral obligation to obey laws against stealing. However, if he perceives a threat to his own safety, whether from the police or anyone else, he might be deterred from robbing someone. But that deterrent effect comes entirely from the threat of violence, not from the claimed authority underlying the threat. This means that supposed authority is never what stops actual crimes from happening. As a matter of fact, they make it a lot worse, as we'll see later. Some assert that without government inspectors and regulators, every business would be putting out dubious, dangerous products. But such a claim is again based upon a profound misunderstanding of human nature and economics. No matter how greedy or selfish a businessman may be, he cannot be successful in the long run if he sells products which do not please his customers. Someone who knowingly sells defective products or tainted food will have few, if any, customers left at some point. Take the many highly expensive recalls, for instance, which many companies voluntarily carry out, even for relatively trivial defects or problems. This attests to this fact, and that's all being done voluntarily, unlike in the current situation, in which the power of governments is used to prop up and protect irresponsible and destructive large corporations. However, in a truly free market, with informed consumers and open competition, corruption and crime would not pay, and businesses would be unable to insulate themselves from the consequences of their irresponsibility. In fact, the authority superstition is constantly interfering with people who attempt to organize for mutual benefit by throwing taxes, licensing requirements, regulations, inspectors, and other legal obstacles in the way. Even laws supposedly intended to protect consumers usually do nothing but limit the options available to consumers. The end result is that many businessmen who otherwise would have to focus on making a better product at a better price instead focus on lobbying those in government to do things which handicap or destroy competing businesses. Take suing in a government court, for instance, where the judge can be bribed into supporting the billion-dollar business. In other words, rather than being essential to an organized society, the myth of authority is the biggest obstacle to human beings organizing for mutual benefit. The way to become rich in a free society that is devoid of any supposed government authority is by providing products and services which actually benefit the customer. Even the most greedy, heartless businessman would have a huge incentive to not anger his customers to the point where they stop buying his products. So the idea that government is a requisite of civilization because there needs to be protection is tantamount to, well, we need to have a centralized ruling class that coerces us, steals from us, dominates us under the threat of assaulting and kidnapping us and putting us in a cage so that we can be protected from people who want to dominate us, steal from us, assault us, kidnap us, and confine us. That's literally akin to, well, we need to have a carjacker in our neighborhood, otherwise people will steal our car. Yeah, but that's not the same, because we get something back. Okay, well, suppose I would steal your money under the threat of harming you, and the next day I would come back to you and give you a sandwich. Now you benefited. You got something in return. Does that justify my act of robbery? You would probably go like, wait a minute, that doesn't make it right. You stole from me under the threat of violence, and I didn't consent to it. How does this make it better? Actual justice means protecting the innocent from aggressors, and government is always the aggressor. It controls people's lives, it steals from people in the name of taxation, confiscation, regulation, legislation, or whatever euphemism you happen to use. The fact that occasionally it stops some other thieves doesn't make it moral or virtuous, any more than it's moral to have an organized mafia taking over a city because it has caused lower level crime to go down because that mafia doesn't want competition. Government is nothing more than a protection racket. You will give us money to do business in this vicinity, and we will protect you. But primarily it is to protect you from ourselves, because we will hurt you and destroy your life if you don't pay us our demanded fee, or protection money. The only difference being the names used. And that's something I've noticed all over this system. The idea that you can give something unacceptable a different name, usually a euphemized version of the actual unacceptable behavior, and repeat that it's legitimate, ad nauseum, and let people memorize and regurgitate these ideas from the time they are very small all the way to when they're full-grown adults, is blatant lunacy. This has nothing to do with reason or logic. This is an age-old doctrine that people are being forced to concede to under the threat of harm being done to them, which by definition constitutes injustice and terrorism. And that again shows the mentality of statists. They look up to this idea that somehow this special group of people, who represent a scribble on a piece of paper called a law that was written by mere people, are exempt from the rules of morality that applies to every normal individual, such as don't steal, don't murder, don't threaten, etc. And to me that sounds more like a religion. You revere written texts and people with religious fervour, hence why their attempts at evangelizing the concept of government authority are so completely irrational and logically inconsistent. That is why their enforcers with badges and shiny symbols have guns. They have to enforce this idea, because it bears no resemblance to reality. They don't have rights that we don't have. And of course, under control you might say that there are more deterrents. But consider the following, and this will make clear to you that control and authority will always lead to more destruction and chaos than the absence of it. Because the idea that you can fight fire with more fire logically follows that it only makes the situation worse. And I can show you. Suppose a group of people wearing the label of governments declared alcohol to be illegal and created a heavily armed gang of enforcers to hunt down and imprison any person caught possessing alcohol. Since that actually happened, there is no need to theorize about the results. With the promise of fixing most of society's ills, and with public support, the US ruling class enacted alcohol prohibition in 1920. After that, alcohol consumption continued, albeit slightly reduced, and there immediately sprang up a black market in alcohol production and distribution. A hugely profitable but illegal market led to violent conflicts, a jump in organized crime and other crime, and widespread corruption in governments, as well as brutal attempts to crush the alcohol trade. Seeing the actual results of prohibition, a majority of the people soon opposed it. And of course, after prohibition ended, all of the related violence, such as government violence and private violence, ended. Because this is the law of nature. You reap what you sow. You initiate and introduce violence, you will only get violence and harm in return, if not more of it. So governments, by definition, add literally nothing but more violence and harm. It is for the fact that most people don't recognize it as such, because people have been trained to accept the violence and coercion that comes from governments as legitimate, when it isn't. Because violence and coercion is never legitimate, even if performed by a supposed authority. And the idea that you can seize control over drug use or alcohol consumption, or any type of trade, by way of violence and totalitarian surveillance, and that there should be a government that decides what people can and cannot trade, is patently erroneous. Because here's the thing. Imagine that every person lived in a small box. They were not allowed to trade anything, let alone use any drugs or consume alcoholic beverages. They basically had no privacy at all. Everything they have is being searched, their bodies are searched on a continual basis, they're being stopped and interrogated all the time, they are under constant surveillance 24/7, with the presence of the state's enforcers everywhere you could go. Their entire life is controlled to and fro. And again, we don't need to theorize about it, because this concept already exists plainly in the form of prison. And even in a scenario like that, which implies complete and total control, you still cannot withhold people's ability to trade, whatever it is. People still trade for drugs and all kinds of illegal substances in prisons every single day. So let me say that again, more emphatically. You can take away all the privacy rights of an individual, have him under constant surveillance. You can search him, detain him, interrogate him as often as you want basically, and they will still be able to get illegal drugs. Yet you still have people who erroneously believe that you can stop the drug trade by way of introducing more and more violent control and surveillance over people's lives. As if every next step of control and violence will bring you closer to ending drug trade. And to what extent? The point where everybody in society is under constant surveillance? Where people's houses and their bodies are searched at random? Well, that's the only thing it leads to. And is designed to lead to. Totalitarian control and constant surveillance over your life. And incidentally, that still doesn't stop people from trading, including drugs. And this is where gang rivalries and drug wars also gain their constellation. It is purely because drug trade is deemed illegal by governments, which is the only reason for mafias and gangs to exist. Some people are not easily thwarted from their desire to consume certain drugs, and because they cannot acquire it publicly, because of prohibition, that's where they go to black market traders, where mafias and gangs are in the top tier. But if drugs were not illegal, there would be no reason for drug lords to exist. The only reason drug lords exist is because government exists. Because they make it impossible to trade in exchange for drugs unless it's through the drug lords. And if you don't think so, what happened after alcohol prohibition was repealed? Almost the entire alcohol black market disappeared immediately after. And today people trade alcohol on a regular basis, without gangs or organized crime, that existed purely because of government prohibition limiting people's options to trade down to the most potent sellers under those circumstances, which were gangs and mafias. Why would the same not happen in the absence of drug prohibition? So you might say, well, we have to take some measures to stop drug trade, because it's dangerous for the consumer as well as for the people who you might endanger. And alcohol isn't? And again, if you advocate the mitigation or prohibition of substances, be honest about what you want. If you want there to be a government to stop drug trade, what do you ultimately want them to do? It ultimately comes down to spying on people, randomly searching through people's property without consent, kicking down people's door and dragging them away from their friends and family, and caging them for many years if they smoked a bit of marijuana on their own at home. That's all a government can do. Introduce violence. That's your solution? And again, to what extent? We just saw that even the greatest measures of totalitarian control wouldn't stop trade of any kind. So the point is, stopping people from engaging in dangerous drugs by introducing violence and coercion is never going to solve it. It is only going to make it worse. Government is simply never the solution, because government is nothing more than a bunch of people who believe that they have the right to impose their ideas on other people. And because of the extent of its influence, you have the majority of people believing that they have that right, and that they must subvert themselves to the imposition, and that it's wrong to resent such imposition, together with the other superstitions that I've covered in my other videos, like how we would all be eating each other and harming each other in the absence of the violent imposition of a ruling class. Doesn't that sound a bit bizarre? And the point is, most people, most of the time, would still be reluctant to do harm, knowing that they alone would bear both the responsibility and the risks of doing so. There would be a huge incentive to settle disputes and disagreements peacefully and by mutual agreement, when the belief in Government is prevalent, on the other hand, there is no incentive to settle things peacefully, because winning the political battle poses no risk to those who advocate violence via governments. Without a ruling class to whine to legislatively impose some central agenda on everyone, people would be forced to deal with each other as rational adults, instead of as whiny, irresponsible children who look up to the idea of government to enforce something they want upon another, which is basically democracy. People would be far better served by attempts at cooperation and peaceful compromise than they are by fighting over who can get hold of the sword of government. Something that really sums this up is a video from Larken, the author of The Most Dangerous Superstition, which is a book that I highly recommend as one of the top books that I could ever encourage you to read. This video is about what anarchy is not, as there have been many obscurations and mischaracterizations regarding the definition of anarchy. The usual tagline is something that is akin to chaos and destruction, to loathe rules, when such is not the case. As we've mentioned before, anarchy is not the state without rules. It is a state without rulers over others, without dominion over others, without ownership over others, which in essence constitutes the very definition of freedom, because you're not someone else's subject or slave that is threatened with violence and duress. The very things that constitute the definition of chaos, destruction and terrorism. So I highly recommend watching that short video after this one. Another preconceived notion about a world without governments is that if you leave people in freedom, some people will acquire lots of power and dominate others, murder others and extort others. Well, that sounds very familiar, because that's exactly government. And it's even more dangerous than any gang you can think of. With any ordinary gang, people wouldn't feel any moral obligation to put up with it, and would resent, because they wouldn't view the gang as having any supposed right to violently dominate the rest. They wouldn't regard the gang as having any supposed authority, as is the case with governments, where they get away with extortion, trespass, murder, threats and assaults on a daily basis, and has a kill count that is higher than any ostensible gangs in the world combined. And it's because this specific group of thugs has surreptitiously convinced people that it is for their own protection and for the common good. When a domestic or foreign gang sets up a curfew, nobody would tell on his neighbour for sneaking out at night. Because your neighbour is not the enemy, the gang is. But when that gang calls itself government and has convinced people that they are there for their own good and protection, and that it's virtuous and moral to obey their every whim, and that it's immoral to disobey and resist, people would even betray their own family for that violent group of people. People would view someone who has never wronged them as an enemy, when he is an enemy of the state. So by way of collectivism, this centralized ruling class has a sustainable floor from whence they can always exert their power. And that's why it's called the most dangerous superstition. It isn't an attempt at enslaving people physically. It is an attempt at enslaving people in their own minds. An attempt at which they succeeded to a large extent. Many people feel that they are the rightful subjects of a ruling class, and they refuse to look at anything beyond. Fortunately today, there are more and more people that understand the root of all problems, which is control through governments, and are ready to do away with it entirely. How about you? Are you still convinced that peaceful civilization is driven by government authority and forceful rulership, and everything that is voluntary and based on consent is chaos? That without their supposed authority over you and the right to boss you around and steal your money, people would behave like violent animals and be eating each other? Or is that what they want you to think? Please share this video so that it can reach more people. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.